Hello, everyone, and welcome to another debate. I don't want to call it a debate because this one is spooky conspiracy time, and it's between me and JF Garpiey, in which we are going to discuss, debate, whatever, the conspiratorial theory that the left is planning to undermine the importance of European genes because he is crazy. Not well poisoning. I just don't think that is even just a legitimate academic take at this point, but whatever. We're going to get into it, and obviously I'm going to go and, go for the debate. Obviously, I do want everyone to listen to his arguments, listen to my arguments, and see, which you think is better. Judge it for yourself. Use your own reasoning. That's what philosophy is about. I'm here to argue against him and present a case of why I think his position is absurd, which I do, of course, but if you think that his position is more plausible than mine, then let me know. Anyway, so I'm going to go and call them. My God, it's boiling in the UK right now. Okay, a minute. Nope, I wish that didn't happen. Yes, I hear that. Right, yeah.
A second to set him up on OBS, and we'll be good.
Hello there.
Hello.
Yeah, so I'm right now, everyone. I'm just waiting to set up with modern day debates. This is also being hosted on their platform, and so yeah, like they're just gonna see who his opening statement, GF's opening statement, my opening statement, and get into the thick of things. I think that it shouldn't be too long now, but overall, it's a very strange discussion to be having of whether the left is conspiring to undermine, essentially what I would see as measures of European success, to try and explain European success with a debate as a means of undermining genetic importance. I just can't actually wrap my head around anyone actually having this position, but whatever.
So you two are muted. Is that normal?
I muted myself.
I'm
Okay.
muted because I'm just setting up OBS, and when I added the third person, it reset itself. All fun.
Okay.
Just to let you know, I am live. Just waiting to essentially go into the debate. Just to give you a heads up.
All right.
Use can't be seen just yet, by the way. I'll obviously make this visible once the debate is actually, underway. It is roasting here in the UK. Like, it is absolutely sweltering. It's like a heat wave or something at the minute, so I'm currently melting.
Yeah, I'm the same here. It's pretty hot.
Hiya, Jeremy. How you doing, man? Also, hello, Perpetually Annoyed, Loho, NPC, Caleb, Twisted. Nice to see you here, man. Exponent. Is that Maro? Kevin, Tainted, Noob Slayer, Zebedias, Wicked, Jack B, and Ron. Welcome, guys. Nice to see you here. My lord. Hi. I don't even think it's 30 degrees. I don't even think it's 30 degrees. It's still like, what temperature is it? Newcastle temperature. 22. Actually, it's 26, I think. It's 26 degrees. That's like incredibly hot for me. I feel like I'm dying. Hi, Donald. Vigo.
Woohoo. Okay, got the layout set. Just give me another minute to get our little modern day debate script, and we're going, guys.
Sweet. Oh wait a minute, actually, they can't hear me. Sweet. Looking forward to it. Like, in terms of a fan, I have a fan. I can't put the fan on, you see. Like while I'm recording, like while I'm doing this, because like it's just gonna essentially all you'll hear is a fan. Death would be a release. What temperature is it? With 99% humidity. 99% humidity here is pretty high. It's 60% now apparently. Actually, I think it was higher before, but I'm not sure. But as a bust out the tank top, absolutely.
And did you guys decide who's going to go first?
I think it might be good if I go first since I do the positive case. What do you think, PP?
Honestly, I'll just flip a coin again. Really, I mean, like if you want to make, I mean, the positive case is. Like this is the thing. I was planning on James introducing it or so on. I think we both agreed on that. Really, just to outline the fact that the claim in the title, we had to put in the modern day debates title, we had to limit it to, let's say, nature versus nurture as a leftist conspiracy, whilst the agreed proposition was much longer and
Absolutely,
obviously related to a conspiracy. An academic conspiracy construed by the left to undermine the importance of European genes. So, I mean, that's obviously a very different title. I mean, if you want to introduce it with that, if you want to rock up like saying like, okay, so you mightn't have got this from the title, but I am arguing here that there is a leftist conspiracy in academia to construct a nature versus nurture debate to undermine the importance of European genes and the success of societies or whatever, societal success, then yeah, you can do that, man. But that's up to you.
All right. So I can do intro, and yes, I will stand for everything you just said.
And okay, did in between that, I was half listening. Did we figure out who's going to go first?
So are you good if I go first? Then I will stand with the point you just described.
Yeah, that sounds fair. If you wanna do that.
All right.
All right. Well, with that, guys, I think we're good to go. And give me a minute, and we'll go live.
I'm trying to work out where this is actually. Oh, right there we go. All right. Could one of you speak just so I can get your volume?
Testing.
Test.
Okay, that should be all right. Oh. Right.
And all right. So at the beginning of the end, I'm just going to wait 30 seconds. That's just our little intro. And if I'm very silent at the very end, that's just because I got to let the outro go. But besides that, all right, we're about to go live. In 3, 2, 1, and we are streaming.
No, can you not?
Welcome, everyone, to Modern Day Debate. We are a neutral platform welcoming everybody from all walks of life. So if you're looking for more juicy debates, don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you like what you hear tonight, both of our debaters' links are in the description below. And with that, we are going to hand it over.
The chat is saying that you are muted, Amy. Sorry.
No. Welcome. Thank you so very much. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, everyone, to Modern Day Debate. We are a neutral platform. Welcome, everybody, from all walks of life. So if you're looking for more juicy debates, don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you like what you hear tonight from either of our interlocutors, their links are put in the description below. And with that, we're going to hand it over to our first interlocutor, JF, for their first 10-minute opening statement. JF, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Amy. It's a pleasure to be here. So this discussion started with a Twitter interaction with Perspective Philosophy after our last debate, which really had nothing to do, although the titles may seem similar. We debated on genes versus meme, what is the most important thing to leave as a legacy. And in a series of tweets, Perspective Philosophy discovered a position that I've had since a long time, which is that the nature versus nurture debate, very promoted within academia, on which every psychology student is trained in one way or another, and every master's, every PhD in psychology will end up caring about this debate one day or another, that this highly promoted debate is ultimately an idea that is false, one, and it's not only false, because most things in psychology are false. Psychologists are incompetent, and the academia is basically as good as a coin flip to find the truth. But it's a falsehood that is extremely damaging to society, particularly because this falsehood, this idea of a false dichotomy between nature and nurture, is hiding us from a very important truth, which is that parents of European origins have a particular way of parenting. I believe that much of their parental contributions are ultimately caused by genes. I believe that there are good genes of parenting running into the European population. And unfortunately, the nature versus nurture debate, whether you're on one side or another, ignores the contribution of parental genes. And I would go up to say that there is a coordinated effort to deny the importance of European parents in the success of European children, particularly in American society. And so today I need to make three cases to defend my view. The first case I want to make is nature versus nurture is false. It's a false dichotomy. There is no division between the two. Nurture is nature. Caring for your children is part of nature. It's part of what your genes needed to do for your children to be successful. And so the false dichotomy is there. Number two, European parents offer a beneficial form of parenting that improves their children in multiple areas of life. That is simply the fact that white parents in America are more successful than people of other origins. And then the third case I want to make is that academics on both sides of the nature versus nurture debate are finding ways to argue themselves out of the truth of European parental goodness. And as a result, they form a functional conspiracy in which academics, in agreeing together to engage on an obviously fallacious false dichotomy, have the effect of negating the importance of parental quality in the contribution of our children's success. The ultimate end goal of this is delegating parental contributions to the state, abandoning children to the public schools, and even in some of the extreme cases of leftist academics I will quote, we are talking about kidnapping children from white families to have them adopted in Black families, something that is pushed at Harvard University called transracial adoption. What we're looking at here is a project that hurts the European family, which has been under attack for the last 40 years. But let's go back to the beginning and let me take you through this. Is nature versus nurture a false dichotomy? Well, on that, you need to apply some logic here. Is nurture any different than nature? Is there anything in the life of a parent, in the love that you feel for your children, in the services that you deliver to your children? Is there anything that is not generated by your brain, that would have been there if your body wasn't there? Certainly not. The entirety of everything we do with our children, just like the entirety of everything a bird does for its eggs or for its baby birds, is done through the body, and the body is constructed by genes. The tendencies that you would have to gather food to give to your children, they are encoded in your brain. Ultimately, for you to make these movements, you need that brain, and for that brain to exist, you needed your genes. And so normally when we have this presentation, nature versus nurture, this false dichotomy that exists in academia, it is with the idea that there is something separate between human culture and nature. My point to you today is that there is not, that any instance of human culture transmitting itself will transmit between biological brains that have evolved to transmit culture. In the same way, if an ethologist was to go into a bird population, and look at their parental behavior, he wouldn't start qualifying what the bird has learned in terms of nest building as not nature. Every behavior of the bird that could contribute to the success of the baby birds would be included as part of nature. Why do we act differently when it comes down to humans? We act differently because we're pushing, in academia, they are pushing for this fallacy to endure. It goes further than this. There are people within the nature versus nurture debate who continue further than the false dichotomy, which is logically obvious. And they, even on the side of genes, even on the side of nature, the experiments that they propose, that they rely on to gather their information are biased against detecting parental contributions. One of the most popular formats of a study to determine the nature versus nurture dichotomy is twin studies. Twin studies where twins have been separated at birth. One of the twins may have the exact same genes as the other, or he may only share 50%. So that's a dizygotic versus a monozygotic twin pair. They get separated at birth. They get adopted in new environments. And then we can tease apart what were the genes, what was the effect of the environment. But here's precisely where this experiment fails. And it fails at detecting the relationship that exists with a biological parent, his genes, and his parental capacity. The problem is that this study format can detect a lot of things other than this. This is the one thing that it's totally blind to, because by using adoptive families, you have replaced the biological parents, and suddenly all of the interactions that could have happened between the genes of the parents and the genes of the child have just been abolished. So we're looking at children as individuals, and we fail to capture the true complexity of nature, which is that the true complexity of nature are that there are genes that may be very good at connecting biological parents to their biological children. Let me give you a few examples of genes that we could miss through this experimental setup. You could miss a gene that makes a parent a good teacher and a children a good student. You could miss genes that make a parent particularly motivated at caring for their kin, but not so motivated at caring for random children out there. You could miss all these genes that in some way link optimal behavior by the parent to optimal learning behavior by the child. In other words, twin studies are designed in a way that is meant to negate parental contribution. There are also other weaknesses of these studies. They ignore the weirdness of the circumstances that must lead to two twins being separated at birth. Of course, if you're doing only your studies on twins that will get adopted, clearly there must have been a problem in the original family. So you're really studying a subset of genes and a subset of children. It also ignores the normal ecological environment in which families develop, which in the vast majority of cases is biological parents raising biological children. So for all these reasons, the best studies in this domain where people care about the nature-nurture dichotomy are biased, and they hide you from one truth: the importance of the parental contribution, precisely because the adoption trick that is being used in these studies blurs the image of parental contribution. Whereas we have other studies to look at parental contributions, and what they reveal is that, of course, how parents behave with their children matters. I mean, to anyone who's been going around social media, we keep seeing these fights happening in airports right now in the US, and we see children. What?
1 more minute left.
Okay, 1 more minute. We see children seeing their own mothers go insane, attack the cashiers, attack the aunt, attack the uncle. Clearly, children who are exposed to this variety of emotional behavior will be traumatized by it. But unfortunately, the typical study sets that we use for the nature-nurture debate do not capture this complexity. So this closes it for my point on, is nature versus nurture a false dichotomy? Yes, it is. In the normal circumstances, the genes of the parents matter, the genes of the children matter, and they communicate with each other through various teaching and brain features that are developed for the purpose of the parental-child relationship. Now, I will move on later in the debate on, are European parents different, and are they better at what they do? And then we're going to look into the leftist academics who seek to exploit these false dichotomies, these weak features of the experimental setups to make their leftist arguments. But for now, it will be the turn of perspective philosophy.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, JF, for your 10-minute opening statement. And now we're going to hand it off to Perspective Philosophy for his 10 minutes.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really appreciate it for having us on here to once again debate JF. And yes, this did start on Twitter, as all good debates do. Obviously, it began because of that airport, video that you posted, which is I found quite funny, and we'll get onto that in a moment. But the nature versus nurture debate really is not supposed to be, let's say, a dichotomous relationship anyway. The whole point is to work out how much of an impact environment, culture, and other external factors can have upon the development and behavior of a child in comparative to their nature, quote unquote, their genes. It's not necessarily to undermine the importance of genes, but also not to overstate the importance of genes. Charles Darwin himself once wrote, "The greatest error to which I have committed has been not allowing sufficient weight to the direct action of the environment, i.e. food, climate, independently of natural selection." If that critique can be leveled at Darwin, it can be doubly leveled at my interlocutor, JF. JF repeatedly overstates the importance of genetics in terms of outcome and societal outcome. He really reduces all human behavior, human action, to genetic expression. Well, that might not necessarily be the case. Now, this debate is not only upon genes and whether the environment or genes is more important, or whether the nature and versus nurture debate is well suited for the discussion that we need to have, but rather that there is a conspiratorial aspect to this debate, that this debate has been set up by left-wing academics, or academics as a whole, since JF basically threw out psychology, philosophy, history, and anthropology as left-wing and biased for conducting the nature versus nurture debate. And they are biased simply for conducting the debate. The debate itself is a distraction, apparently, from the fundamental importance of European genes. And so, in order to break this discussion down, I think that we need to really recognize some of the points of contention. So I think that the first point of contention is, what do we mean by success? What is the success of Europe that we are attributing to genetic material? Is it the material growth of Europe? Is it an ideological factor in Europe? Let's say, for example, happiness reports. What is it? The next aspect, I think, is how important is the environment in relation to genetic expression? Does the environment or does genetic material play a greater overall role in the development of European success, and how much of a role does it play in the success of any human alive? And then the third point is, do we have any evidence to show that this debate has been constructed in order to undermine the truth, or, for example, the political opposition, in order to fulfill some sort of agenda or mandate? So have the left conspired this debate to gain some sort of foothold in our society? So my opponent also said that nature versus nurture is essentially a false dichotomy. Well, I don't believe that to be the case. I think nature versus nurture is a pretty good dichotomy to have, because it allows us to differentiate various causes which might explain why an individual may behave one way and another way, depending upon their upbringing, the resources that were around during their development, and even the expression of psychological disorders. Okay? So even if we agree on a physicalist narrative, which I do not, I am not a physicalist, but even if we were to agree on a physicalist narrative, there are a multitude of physical causes which are not simply genetic and can be attributed to other aspects of nature, quote unquote. For example, the abundance of resources in a region would have a great deal of importance upon the development of a nation in terms of its quote unquote success. So, for example, if you are looking at the Japanese development of swords versus the European development of swords, you would see that the Europeans developed better swords faster. And that had a lot to do, not with the capacity and the genetics available for individuals to produce swords. The Japanese have very complex and creative ways of dealing with their poor iron deposits, but their iron deposits were poorer, and so they weren't able to create spring steel, and the Europeans were, which led to a great many of other inventions, just off the back of one resource distribution difference. This is not even considering, for example, cultural differences, which have contributed to differences in the production of ceramics versus glass, and so on. Okay, my opponent also wants to argue that culture, the norms and conventions of our society, is attributable purely to genetic expression, that our brains are produced by nature, and so the production of our culture is from those brains, and our behaviors can only be explained in relation to the causal inferences created from brain states, which is, to be entirely honest with you, neurologically outdated. Brain plasticity has showed that the brain itself is dependent upon the environment in which it's situated. Not only that, but our genetic expression is dependent upon the environment in which it's situated. And this is the study of, for example, epigenetics. Epigenetics has showed that, let's say, the birth weight of a child is dependent upon the food consumption of the mother, but also the environment of the womb. If you were to transplant for example, an embryo to a surrogate mother, it is likely to have a greater impact than the genetic material given from the biological mother, and the surrogate mother, their womb will have a greater impact upon the birth weight than the genetic material provided. This is even demonstrated in weight loss surgeries on the same mother. You can have the same mother give genetic material, and it will still have a greater impact if they've had in the likelihood of childhood obesity if they've had weight loss surgery. The likelihood of childhood obesity then is regulated not necessarily by the genetic material, but by the environment in which the individual is actually raised and develops into and develops around. Whether my opponent recognizes this or not, culture does causally impact our biology. The education systems that we have, the religion that we have, all cultural aspects have a great overall contribution to our brain states, but also our mental development. A good example would be something like obsessive compulsive disorder. The religion of someone with obsessive compulsive disorder determines vastly different conclusions to how it will vastly different outcomes to someone of a different religion. A good example is, for example, if someone is a fundamentalist, let's say Islam or Judaism, if they have OCD versus a Christian with OCD. A Christian is most likely to express OCD in terms of blasphemy. For example, insults to God, fearing of insulting God. This could be this could be let's say fear of demons and demonic symbols. It could be fear of stepping on crosses. And I think it was Martin Luther who used to have intrusive imagery of the devil's backside. Now, Islam and Jews and Judaism typically have obsessive compulsions centered around performing ritual correctly. Now, these expressions of their obsessive compulsive disorder are purely cultural in origin. If I was to take someone with OCD and raise them in an environment which was, Islamic and not Christian, they will have different expressions of that OCD to varying levels. And so what we have to ask ourselves in this is, does genetic reductionism give greater explanatory power than psychology, history, philosophy, and all other forms of social sciences? Although I will agree, I don't think they are sciences, but social philosophies and humanities as a whole. I don't believe that my opponent can demonstrate that genetic reduction gives greater explanatory power simply because he argues that everything is reducible to the brain. Because even if it is reducible to the brain, our society and the analysis of our society will give a greater explanation of how our brains develop. My opponent also talked about trauma, and particularly involved in the horrific airport incident from which I was allowed to witness as well, from sharing it on Twitter. And yet it seems that this was an entirely environmental circumstance. Not only does the child is the child going to be traumatized, quote unquote, manipulating their brain states because of the experience they've had in life and not necessarily their genetic material, but also the way in which our institutions have functioned directly changed the outcome of how the mother behaved. The mother behaved in such a way. Thank you. The mother behaved in such a way and could behave in such a way, and it would be seen as traumatizing by the child because of the norms and conventions of our culture. We have recognized, even in relation to, PTSD or PITS disorder, perpetration-induced traumatic stress, that certain environmental factors can play a protective role in the development of this disorder. And so even if we are established that this was a traumatic event, it is only traumatic in relation to the ideology that is being perpetuated in the norms and conventions of our society and also internalized by that child. And so, I'm sorry, Jeff, nature versus nurture is an important debate, and it's certainly not a leftist conspiracy, and I would like you to demonstrate the conspiratorial aspect as well.
All right.
Thank you so very much, Perspective Philosophy, for your opening 10-minute statement. And with that, we're going to go into the 40-minute or plus some change open discussion. The floor is all yours, guys.
All right, a couple of responses to what was done in the intro by Perspective Philosophy, and then we can move on to, are European parents really different? He says at the beginning, he says that nature versus nurture is not meant to be a dichotomy. It's meant to look at external factors, but it has to be a dichotomy if you want to use the word versus. And in fact, later he says nature versus nurture is a useful dichotomy to have. Well, that's a contradiction with your earlier statement. So do you believe there's a dichotomy or not between the two? Do you believe that any of the examples that you gave are purely nurture, independent of genes?
Sorry, well, when I say dichotomy, I mean like absolutely opposed. I mean, the whole point of this is to separate, let's say, to like, because we could have this debate under a physicalist framework, right? You can have nature versus nurture, arguing from purely material causation, right? So you could have nature being the genetic material of the individual, and then nurture being the cultural environment, which you could still say was determined by physical causation, you know, everything originating from the Big Bang, but, you know, not solely dependent upon genes and gene expression. So when I say it's not dichotomous, I mean, one, it necessarily doesn't mean that one has to override the other, that there is no room for both nature and nurture, but rather whether nature or nurture, you know, external or internal causes, are have better explanatory power to certain aspects of behavioral outcome.
Well, the problem is if you're going to call it versus one versus the other, you need to have cases where nurture is truly something separate from nature. You need a dichotomy, or else you're making a false dichotomy. The problem is all the examples you've given. You talked about Christians being more likely to express OCD in a certain fashion due to cultural influence. You said the girl in the airport maybe was traumatized, but she was only traumatized in relation to cultural norms. The problem is that all the cultural norms you're talking about, the Christianity, the neurological effect, even the epigenetics and the brain plasticity, all of it is handled by genes. Ultimately, the traumatized girl in the airport, the little child, was seeing her mother go batshit insane. And that is because her mother has certain genes. If she had squirrel genes, her mother wouldn't have attacked the cashier. She would have gathered some nuts.
Well, I mean, like you can say that the individual's propensity might be have genetic factors, but we know that things like, for example, stress have a great impact to psychological disorders. For example, like schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is sometimes considered a stress-induced disorder. So an individual's environment plays a massive role in whether the gene is, you know, even if you are likely to have a genetic propensity to that disorder, whether it will actually become active within the individual, whether the individual will develop schizophrenia. We even see this in physical causation. You've got something like Alzheimer's being regulated by the AP0E gene or the AP09 gene, which is most prevalent in Nigeria. You are 9 to 13 times more likely to develop Alzheimer's if you have that gene. Yet, cultures which have the gene, which have a different diet, for example, than contemporary Western cultures, have lower rates of Alzheimer's and dementia. So, the point of the discussion is not to say that when we talk about nature, it is nature is only understandable through genetic causes. That would be fallacious. Like, for example, trying to say that the sun or the amount of resource distribution or any other physical cause can be explained through genes, when the genes themselves can be explained by those causes. Can you at least recognize that when we are separating nature versus nurture, what we are really doing is separating internal and external factors upon an individual's development?
Well, if that was it, then we should say there's a debate between internal and external factor, but that's not what the academia decided to do. They decided to build a false dichotomy of nature versus nurture. And by the way, you seem to think that resource availability is merely an issue of environment. It is not. Ultimately, the reason why Europeans converge toward places where there are rivers and places where there are access to the sea is a genetic one. There are people who have propensity to get toward the desert, and there are people who have propensities to go toward other environments. And there are people who have genetic propensities to be able to mine stuff that others would just have walked over and not realize they were sitting on a gold mine.
And what propensity is that? Like, where does the mining gene come from?
Well, the mining gene seems to have come in the history and the development of the populations between the Middle East to Europe. It seems that it is the places where the Bronze Age has emerged and where tools were developed and where needs for metals have developed enough to motivate a social effort to be mining.
So why do you think that it's genetic and not necessarily, let's say, explainable through environment or even fortune? Like, so like you can recognize that there are physical aspects of reality which go beyond genetic expression, right? So like even if you were to have two individuals with the same genetic expression in two similar environments, but the environment was, let's say, changed by something even minor, which allowed the individual to have a greater experience of some sort of phenomena. Take, for example, an individual stumbles into a mine, or an individual witnesses an event which leads them to, like, an apple falls on your head, for example, and you start, contemplating why the apple fell on your head. Do you not recognize that there are external factors which, even if we were to, equalize genes, would play a vital role in the development of a society and a culture?
I would like to recognize this if you had a demonstration that any of the things you just listed can be done independent of genes, and my suspicion is that none can be done independent of genes.
That something
you
can be
talk
done.
of mining, for example. Well, to have the idea of mining and to do it seriously and productively, you need some degree of IQ. You're not going to become a miner 10,000 years ago with 60 IQ. You're going to have some degree of intelligence to figure it out. You're going to have to know how to melt the metals and extract it. And so, yes, I think that genes are involved in anything that matters to humans, in the entire reality that is around them. Even the apples ultimately are just our relationship with another life form, which is trees producing apples. The trees have genes, and when you get hit by the apple, it's ultimately a consequence of there being genes around you. My point to you is the environment is made up of genes. So everything you name in the environment will end up being made up of genes. The exception being volcanoes, maybe, meteorites, maybe. That's it.
I am reading the chat, by the way. Just okay, wait a minute. So apples are genes. So like so if I was to say that when we talk about nature versus nurture in a debate, like, let's be honest, the academic debate is really, do the genetic material of the individual that we are talking about have greater likelihood of determining outcome than something like the environment, which would be the genetics of the apple. They're not really calculating whether the genetics of apples have like, in terms of the nature versus nurture. We don't take the genetics of apples to be the decisive factor of or the genetic expression from which we are analyzing. We're not like, okay, well, if we really break it down, we're not looking at the genetics of you, but we're looking at the genetics of all of nature and your position within it. That's just essentially to break down the nature versus nurture debate into something absolutely separate, which is to essentially say, okay, everything can be explained in a biological framework. And it's like, okay, yes, it can. Yes, we can break down the all of this into if we were to accept physicalism, into a biological framework. But then why should we accept a biological framework? Why should we not accept a chemical framework? Why should we not accept a physical framework, like physicist framework? Why should we not accept, for example, any other epistemological field in order to explain behavior if we accept that? I mean, don't get me wrong, I completely disagree with this. I don't think that behaviors can be absolutely pinned down to physical causes. But if I was to accept it, I don't have to look towards biology as to gain explanatory power. I could look towards physics. So why should I accept purely a biological take and not a physical take?
Very interesting. Now, I think this will close this part of the conversation, and I'll move on to my second point. But I'm happy that you noted, yes, we can. Yes, we can see that ultimately in the environment, in what we call nurture in our academic talk, we find genes, and we should understand the relationship between the genes of the parent and the genes of the child as an ecological relationship. Now, on your question, why is it more useful? Well, because physics furnishes too distant of an insight on the matters developing over evolutionary times. You could ultimately boil it down to atoms bumping on one another. Ultimately, life is nothing else than physics. It is the deployment of a special subset of physics into physical existence. The reason we should focus on biology and an ecological understanding of the position of children in our society is that biology furnishes the tool to understand where society is headed. Because of the theory of natural selection, we can know where things are headed. We can know if squirrels need nuts to survive, we can know that they will evolve bodies that can find nuts. And if humans need parental attachment to survive, they will evolve in a way as to deliver and receive parental attachment. So that would be it for my answer to you. Now we can move to the second question that I wanted to touch upon.
I would like to just
Are European
respond.
Parents different? Sorry, what?
I would like to quickly respond to that.
Okay, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, like you say, physics is too distant, and then chemistry, I'm assuming, is too distant, and so biology is far closer. Yet I would say that biology is not too close at all. I mean, the lack of explanatory power of human behavior derivative from biology is, profound. I can't actually point towards not only outcomes, but overall any particular behavior based on purely gene expression. I mean, even in autistics, even in a select group of individuals, we typically say that if you've met one autistic, then you've met one autistic, because there's over 35,000 genes associated with autism alone. And that is only one subsect of our society, which is neurodivergent. This isn't even the broader overall picture, and we can't even describe the outcomes for those individuals based on genetic expression. If
you said there are 35,000 genes associated with autism,
mm-hmm.
There are 10,000 genes in the human genome. Where did you find the 25,000 others?
It's not 35,000 genes. It's like relationships between genes.
Okay. Well, diversity in the autism population is not denied by biology. Biology totally allows the development of diversity.
Well, like if you will, I'm just quickly finish what I was saying. So biology gives us certain amount of explanatory power. I could say that, understanding that someone would be autistic can give me a great amount of explanatory power on how that individual may engage within our society. But it will not tell me certain outcomes unless I look into greater overall cultural developments, how our culture approaches autism, how autistics fare in terms of immigration and so on. And this is where psychology, philosophy, anthropology and history all play a role. When we understand and analyze our culture and the impact it can have on an individual who has a certain genetic expression, we gain greater overall explanatory power. And so I'm not even saying, let's get rid of biology as having any explanatory power. I'm saying that it is absolutely absurd to replace every single other field which has its own methodology and its own means of extracting truth from observation and from reasoning with a biological take. It's like, okay, even if it was reducible to biology, that doesn't mean we ought to reduce it to biology.
Well, you seem to be insisting a lot on the reducing to biology. I don't reduce anything. I'm interested in the complexity of the psychology of humans, but we have to be honest about what it is. It is not something else than biology. It is biology. Biology applies to the ensemble of all phenotypes produced by any replicator. Anything that DNA produces is part of biology, including the human brain, in my view. Now let's talk about my second threshold of demonstration. Are Europeans' parents different? I think that the best insight on this comes from transracial adoption studies. John Lowland in Group Differences in Intelligence shows that interracial couples, based on whether the mother was white or the father black, or whether the father was white and the mother was black, he looks at the development of children and he concludes that children who are interracial but who come from white mothers will develop to have higher IQ than children who are from interracial couples, but they are developing in black mothers. So this touches upon a point you made earlier, which is that the prenatal environment of the uterus of the mother may matter a lot in terms of delivery of nutrients, in terms of ultimately reaching IQ, reaching higher intelligence in adulthood. So there is a lot of evidence that it matters whether you are a Black parent or a white parent to the outcome of your children. In fact, the transracial adoption studies have shown that there is higher IQ score in Black children that are adopted in white middle-class environment or upper-class environment. So there is something that white parents furnish to their children, and it's so beneficial that it can even be beneficial to someone coming from another race. They can develop higher IQ. Their IQ will not attain the average of white children coming from these families, but they will be slightly higher than they would have been in their Black biological families. The researchers in this study called the IQ test performance of Black children adopted by white family, that is from Sandra Scar and Richard Weinberg. They write, the high IQ score of the socially classified Black adoptees indicate malleability for IQ under rearing conditions that are relevant to the test and the schools. I take the two facts that I mentioned as evidence, solid evidence, that white parents furnish something to their children that is beneficial to them, that helps them reach higher IQ and higher educational performance, and as a consequence, higher a lot of things, including better wealth, better adult IQ, less criminality, etc. Another evidence that European parents significantly differ from others is in the amount of work that they are willing to put in the education of their children. So the National Household Education Survey program shows that homeschooling in the US is a white phenomenon. 3.8% of white children are homeschooled in the US, and this likely grew significantly since COVID. I'm only talking here about data from 2016, so before COVID, versus 1.9% of Black parents homeschooling. So the dedication to homeschooling by white parents show that they are, when they can, they are willing to invest more in the complete education of their children and therefore in their future success. Of course, homeschooling is associated with higher quality education of the children and better results when they become adults. I cite Richard Medlin here in Homeschooling and the Question of Socialization Revisited. He says, compared to children attending conventional schools, research suggests that they have higher quality friendships, better relationships with their parents and other adults. They are happy, optimistic, and satisfied with their lives. Their moral reasoning is at least as advanced as that of other children, and they may be more likely to act unselfishly. As adolescents, they have a strong sense of social responsibility and exhibit less emotional turmoil and problem behaviors than their peers. And in the academic and social benefits of homeschooling, Carlos Valiente and Brian D. Ray in 2020, they reviewed 16 peer-reviewed studies, which shows that homeschoolers systematically outclass people who are raised in public schools in the US in terms of their GPA, political tolerance, and college retention compared to conventional school. So there's no doubt that white parents, when they can, they end up investing more time in the development of their children, and that they are making their children better with this in a way that is so clear that it can actually be done to a Black children in the cases where they get adopted. So would you agree with this case that European parents have a different approach to parenting?
I think what you, if I'm, I mean, I don't know if you listen necessarily to yourself and how you've explained this, but if anything, I think you've demonstrated the importance of environment and not genetic predisposition. Not only that, I mean, I do disagree with the racial characterization, which I'll definitely get into in a second, but you've just essentially stated that an individual's schooling, an individual's environment, despite their genetic predisposition, is more of a factor of their IQ and their brain development than their genes. I don't know what to say to you, man. Anyway, But let's have a look. Whether it's white mothers versus black mothers that is actually causing the issue. So obviously, in terms of this racial disparity, I'm sure obviously all of these studies would have controlled for necessarily what would it be? Income, cultural background, was it the possibility of having the time to homeschool and so on. So whether these options are even available, and not even to mention other factors like likelihood to the likelihood to breastfeed or something like that. If in terms of like black mothers who are raising their own children and so on, there's so much involved in this that it's, to be entirely honest with you, almost too complex to really test. But it would definitely need a very detailed and very controlled experiment to test this. And I very much doubt that they're controlling for diet, income, geography, and so on. What we've found in terms of it being racial gene expression, I think that's ludicrous. I think even pointing it towards something like race is far too simplistic. Like, even if we were to accept a physicalist position, look at the education outcomes between two separate black populations within the UK. So if we were to take African British kids and Caribbean British kids, if we take Caribbean British kids, they have low outcomes in terms of education, lower than the average white kid. But African British kids have higher education outcomes than the average British child. And this is more to do with the environment from which they're raised. For example, like things like immigrant bias and so on. We need to consider, how individuals' environment and geography has a great impact upon their development. What we've found in terms of the UK in the education report is that geography plays a massive role, and that's influenced by, like, obviously poverty, culture, and other environmental factors such as likelihood to have your father present, or to have services available from which aren't over exceeded, and so on. What's the word I'm looking for? Over used, essentially. There's just capable of actually providing the service they need. So when we look at like a variation between outcomes of black kids and white kids, pointing it down to purely to mothers based on their race is just way too simplistic. We can control for race and we still see a difference in terms of geographical location. Like, even if we were to accept what you said, the environment would still play a role, and I don't accept what you said.
Well, let's examine what perspective philosophy has answered. He says, if anything, you made a case for nurture or the environment, and then he demands control for income, cultural background. And then he's largely fighting a straw man where he claims that I'm attributing all of this to black mother or white mother. That was just one study, and it's really a small effect on IQ. I still attribute most of the effect on IQ based on twin studies. Most of the IQ is determined by the genes of the child. But I'm saying there is an impact, and we're talking about 1 to 6 IQ points in the various studies I've mentioned, either based on whether the mother is white in the prenatal environment study, or whether the adoptive family is white in the transracial adoption study. So I don't need to control for income because white parents are making more income. And the reason they're making more income is that they have the genes to do it. That's demonstrated in twin studies.
Absurd. Look, like, let's be honest. If we look like towards even disparities in white communities, you can have two individuals who are placed in two separate geographical environments who are likely to earn differently based upon the culture from which they're raised. Look. If I was taught to go into STEM and become an engineer, I'm going to have a greater overall likelihood of having a higher wage, but I will also have a greater overall likelihood of not being self-employed. Now, if I was, on the other hand, being raised by individuals who recommend self-employment, Now, why are they recommending self-employment? And you can point it out, oh, well, it's because of genes. Like in terms of the maternal environment, it's all dependent upon genes. But why should I accept that the maternal environment is purely dependent upon genes? There is no reason to believe this. You've only stated that there is a discrepancy between one family and another, and that has led to a difference. And that difference can be accounted from environmental causes. But even in terms of the cultural expression of education, that does not necessarily boil down to a biological cause. You can't just say that an individual being white is the reason that, is the reason that they are more likely to be wealthy. Because we have plenty of poor white people, or an individual being well educated is tied to the underlying genes. It's not necessarily. They could have been born in an environment which has had a overall greater amount of resource distribution and had an economic boom. Like they may have a small population and a great amount of resources. They're born into Sweden or Scandinavia. Like it's just not so simple. Like this is essentially bad reductionism.
Okay, I want to complete on this second point because I really want us to complete the third point, which will be quick, and then we can jump, I guess, Amy, on the questions of the chat, the super chats. But I will say in conclusion to perspective philosophy, you're attacking a straw man. I didn't say the race of the white woman causes the increase in IQ.
The only study that you brought.
But what I argue is that there are different populations. There's a European descent population in America. There's a black population descending from Africa, and that they have different delivery of parental services to their children. And by the way, I include income in this. The parents who have higher income are really building a better nest for their children. If I saw a bird build a better nest for its eggs, I wouldn't say, oh, it's the environment because the nest is made of straw. No, ultimately it boils down to the parental capacity in delivering something good for the children. You decide to call it environment, but you negate the fact that it is ultimately an environment made of other genes, the genes of the parent that will be partly in the child. So moving to the third point.
Well, I mean, look, before we move to the third point, let's just recognize that even the economic disparities being pushed down to genetic differences is not even, it doesn't explain anything. If I was to say that the reason that an individual is from a low economic background in the United States is because they are African American. That's not necessarily true. And, not only do we see that, obviously, individuals who manage to escape poverty, don't necessarily, African Americans can escape poverty and change to different environments and have different academic outcomes and so on. But also the recognition that the poverty that they're in can be regulated by other external causes than their own gene expression. You could be born a genius in the ghetto and get shot at the age of 15. It doesn't matter. The crime rates, the poverty rates, all of this are not necessarily absolutely independent of genes. It was their unfortunate circumstance to come from a descendant who was enslaved by, for example, the white population of that era. But that enslavement has had a historical result, which led to redlining, which led to systemic racism and institutional abuse, and which has caused a great amount of poverty. Just as individuals born of different classes, which are of the same race, for example, white people in the United States, have faced similar issues. You could be born even from a different religion or a different nationality. Irish descendants in the United States, Italian descendants in the United States, and they all seem to suffer when it comes to low income environments. Poverty has a massive overall impact, and that poverty is not simply dependent upon the genetic expression of the individual, but also upon their engagement with other individuals. And if you just say, oh, well, other individuals are made of genes, well, that doesn't give me greater explanatory power than a psychological cultural framework, which is the whole point of why we're engaging in this discussion.
Well, on the question of whether wealth or living in the ghetto is influenced by genes, I will refer to people to dissecting polygenic signals from genome-wide association studies on human behavior by Abdel Abdellaoui and Karen Verweij. They show that among the things that are predicted by genes in twin studies, so they are linked to genes in a causal fashion. There is adult IQ and income. Income is almost 80% plus determined by genes as assessed by twin studies, which are the highest standard.
Twin studies are not the highest. The twin studies are not the highest standard. There is a definite, like, from what I looked into some of the twin studies that you shared. Unfortunately, some of them weren't available. Like, though just the abstracts were available. But from the twin studies that I could get my hands on, they didn't seem necessarily to be that rigorous in terms of controlling for environmental differences. The idea was to show that outcome was based upon like genetic expression rather than environmental differences, but there didn't seem to be enough data to support that claim.
Perspective philosophy is saying it's not the highest standard. I will be waiting for him to find a study that is better at assessing the minimal contribution of genes than a twin study.
But we have epigenetic studies which contradict this. So we have for example, like even in terms of genetic expression, we have epigenetic studies, right? So we have studies which show that gene expression is modulated by the environment, and so totally. So if I was to take, for example, one of the twins, right, which could be, they could be identical twins, and you could take one of their, embryos and deposit it in a surrogate mother. Let's just, hypothesize that we deposit it in a surrogate mother and kept the other in their biological mother. We will see a difference in outcome, physical outcome, just on the modulation of that environmental difference. Because of the mother from which was carrying them. We've seen differences in the food consumed, activating and deactivating certain genes. In terms of genetic expression, like the base genes that you have aren't necessarily the genes that you will continue to have. We will see them deactivated and some activated. And the genes in which you pass on are also not those same genes, because you can pass on some activated genes and some deactivated genes. It's a level of information that is deposited above the DNA. So even in terms of this, even in terms of twin studies, even if we were to keep control the genetic material of one individual and the genetic material of another individual, the reality is that the information which is deposited on the genome will be vastly different just based on epigenetic studies.
Perspective philosophy is simply wrong here, and ridiculously wrong, thinking that you lose your genes because of epigenetics. You don't. Epigenetics is just a marker. And by the way, what's handling the on or off of this marker? It's another gene. And so ultimately, when you have epigenetics, you just have plasticity. I don't deny plasticity. By the way, there are snails. You can give them an electrocute them on some place of the aquarium, and they will never go back to that place of the aquarium. Is it because the environment is having an effect on the snail that suddenly the snail is not a product of genetics? No, it is a product of genetics. It is a product of genes that make the brain able to learn. And epigenetics is a form of learning, but it's still genetics. All right, moving to the academics who argue against parental contribution, and here we touch the heart of the conspiracy, the end of it, the goal. Why are academics so interested in transracial adoption studies and these twin studies? Why are they interested in ultimately dissociating the biological parent from the success of their children? And I will take two examples of it, and one of them comes from the nature side, so they argue for genes. One of them comes from the nurture side, they argue for environment, but both agree on a single thing: parents don't matter. And in fact, in the case of Elizabeth Bartolet, she believes we should kidnap children from poor white parents to give them to richer Black parents. So let's start with Judith Rich Harris. In her book, The Nurture Assumption, so Judith Rich Harris is someone who is a psychologist educated at Harvard. And in her book, The Nurture Assumptions, she goes against the myth, what she calls the myth, that parents matter. She says the experts are wrong. Parental nurturing is not what determines how a child turns out. Children are not socialized by their parents. The nurture assumption is a myth, and most of the research used to support it is worthless. So she goes for the genetic side of explanation, but of course not the genetics of the parents. In that way, she is on the nature side of the debate, and yet she denies the contribution of parents. On what basis does she do it? She does it on the exact same basis as perspective philosophy did throughout this debate, which is to call everything the environment, when in fact the environment is a nest produced by the parents, and the parents are produced by the genes that are carried in the parent. And so even Judith Rich Harris must recognize that at the end, she does say, yep, even in her, she says, I have to acknowledge two things that my case does not undermine. One, parents who do a good job of managing their lives and who get along well with others tend to have children who are like that too. And she also acknowledges that the treatment of children with affection and respect tend to do better in terms of managing their lives and their future personal relationships. So she fails at dismissing the contribution of parents, and ultimately she hides the contribution of parents under the term environment. But you know, and I know, that ultimately the environment that a child lives in is produced by his parents, is a product of the parents' genes. The other intellectual I want to drag attention to is on the side of nurture. She believes so much in the environment that she believes we should essentially pick children randomly at birth and get some white children into black families and base it on the income, base it on whether it would be better for the child. She wants to deprive children of their natural ecological position within their family, their biological family. She was the organizer of the anti-homeschool conference of Harvard, which ended up getting canceled because her beliefs are so outrageous. She states that the focus will be on problems of educational deprivation and child maltreatment that too often occurs under the guise of homeschooling in a legal environment of minimal or no oversight. In other words, she's going after homeschooling, which is a white practice, as I've established earlier in the debate. She goes against homeschooling and wants to characterize homeschooling as a form of abuse of the children. For what? Of course, to deliver the child under the control of the state. In Guiding Principles for Picking Parents, she states, my own view is that biology is clearly not all important, as the new geneticists claim, nor is it as important as traditional family law makes it. Children fare just as well when raised by adoptive parents as when raised by birth parents, so long as they are placed in infancy. Modern development presents us with many new and complex issues in defining parentage. It is important to focus on the basics. The key issues are social, political, and legal, not scientific. We can do what we will. DNA tests cannot force us to decide that one person is a real parent and another is not. It's clear from her statements that the agenda here is to deny the biological importance of parenting, and she's willing to even deny that DNA tests matter in determining who should be the parent. In her text, Cultural Stereotypes Can and Do Die, it's time to move on with transracial adoption. She says, race matching is the direct descendant of white supremacy and of black separatism. For the state to promote the formation of same-race families and discourage the formation of interracial families as it does when it endorses race matching is wrong in my view, for the same reasons that barriers to interracial marriages were wrong. In other words, our program, our agenda, is to make sure that white children will be adopted by black families.
Well, that's not what you just said. I mean, like, if you're going to mischaracterize someone else, I mean, come on. Like, what you just said was that we shouldn't put blocks on transracial adoption. She didn't say we should promote transracial adoption. She didn't say that we ought to put people with, like, white kids with black families. She just said that we shouldn't put legal blocks or cultural conventional blocks from transracial adoption. And I wholeheartedly agree with that. God forbid.
Perspective philosophy. When you call the opposite of your position white supremacy, would you agree that this is some kind of argument that she's promoting the alternative?
Well, I mean, when you call an argument to block black people from adopting white children based on their race, I would say that was a form of racial prejudice. I could understand why that individual would call that let's say white supremacist, especially if it's not going both ways. If you, unless it's even, we won't let white people, adopt black people for the same reason.
It's going both ways. That's what she calls race matching. So the policy in adoption is to favor same race families, and she's going after this. So it goes both ways. They are also denying the likelihood of a black person being,
calls it the descendant of white supremacy, to be considering that a white children needs parents that are genetically close to him.
There's a separation between promotion, though, and like, she's not saying that we ought to mix racial adoption. She's not saying that we ought to put black kids with white parents and white kids with black parents. She's saying that we shouldn't put any blocks conventionally. Well, that's not what I heard.
I mean, you're move on with transracial adoption.
Yeah,
anyway,
to allow it. Yeah.
People will be able to understand from her language that she's really not positive about matching people by race.
Yeah.
Whereas it's important. It matters.
Just because you don't match people by race doesn't mean that you are it's in fact the opposite. It's not mean that you're going to, like, okay, now it's a pick and mix. It's more of like there are other factors in terms of adoption which we might use as metrics to whether one parent adopts a child than the race.
She's not merely saying there are other factors. She wants to remove race as a factor. That is grave. That is grave because it denies the importance of the link between the parent's genes and the child's genes. It matters that children are in line with an harmonic set of genes that have evolved to be parenting that kind of child. We don't know what will be the result of the transracial adoption experiments that she's pushing for. But it's not looking good when you look at the early cases of transracial adoption, because it seems that, yes, kids who are adopted by white families fare better. And that's because European parents are special. They deliver better services in America.
Well,
anyways, that is it for my case. I don't know if you have a concluding word.
You never managed to argue whether it would be modulated by other environmental factors such as educational infrastructure, for poverty rates, for crime rates. I mean, even employment opportunities. Nothing.
It doesn't matter to me,
yes,
because
it does,
all these things.
It doesn't matter because you're biased. That's the only reason.
Who decide? Let me know perspective philosophy. Who decides to go live in the ghetto?
Well, what do you mean? Who decides to go live in the ghetto? You're born.
What is the set of factors that lead a mother to choose to live in the ghetto?
There could be many factors. I mean, hell, there are white people in the ghetto as well, you know.
Okay. What leads a white person to go live in the ghetto?
Poverty.
Poverty? What causes poverty?
There are numerous causes. You can have.
Do you acknowledge that one of the causes is genetic?
Well, you can have genetic dispositions, which are like, so for example, rates of disability and stuff like that.
All right, we're done. That was my case today.
What? Okay, some people are disabled. Therefore, poverty is entirely the result of genetics. What?
Not entirely. Apparently, just a fraction of a percentage, but above 50% of the variance in humanity.
Above 50% of poverty, you think, is determined by race. Yet,
genetics. Genetics.
Oh, okay, well, yeah, but you related that to race like moments ago, which is why you started talking about transracial adoption, as if that had some significance. So unless you're trying to say that there isn't a genetic difference, anyway. Like, I mean, this doesn't even take into consideration, for example, economic disparities, which are becoming undermined now because of changing global positions. For example, like the tiger economy in South Korea. So they were poor for a long time. Oh, but now we've got a massive economic boom. Or what about Japan? You know, and when we look at like Asian countries in general, like, are they genetically superior? The reality of the situation is there is a cultural difference which is promoting their families to increase educational rates, sometimes to the detriment of the welfare of those individuals. For example, in Japan, the culture may increase likelihood of economic prosperity, but it also increases suicide rates, which is not ideal for those individuals who are living within those societies, brings me back to the fact that you've never actually defined success. You never managed to define success. You didn't say what success meant in this scenario. Is it simply material outcome? Is it happiness reports? What moral metric are we using?
Depending on what we talk about. When I talk about these studies, success is often measured in terms of wealth. How do I see success? And ultimately, you're talking about Asian civilization. That's where, to me, there's a big difference between Asian civilization and European civilization. Is that Europeans have innovated in the last 200 years.
But
Europeans have invented stuff, and Asians have copied it.
But that's not necessarily the case. Actually, if you look at Europeans didn't invent a lot of the things that they depended upon for those innovations. For example, mathematics. We can look towards the innovations of mathematics to to India and Persia. I mean, most of our mathematicians during just prior to the Industrial Revolution were relying upon works that were translated from Iranian, from Persian to English. The reality of the situation is that many of the cultural innovations that our society would claim haven't even originated, or at least the first principles from which they've developed upon haven't originated from even this quote unquote genetic environment. So does that mean that our genes have produced that we can attribute this to Iranian genes or to Hindi genes or what are we Indian genes? What are we attributing this to? It's just a form of reductionism.
That's
Can
blurring,
answer that?
Yeah,
I just want you guys to go. Well, I want you guys to finish your line of discourse, and then when both you are ready, we'll move on to questions.
I'm ready to move on to questions. Essentially, perspective philosophy is making a case for first principles coming from Iran. Okay, so the Europeans had all the genes needed to develop calculus, but somehow we were not able to develop the zero as a number. Whoa, very impressive case here, PP. Let's go to Q&A.
It was more of an observation that the mathematical models that we use today and the way that we taught mathematics to our academics were actually derived from Persia. So it's not even to say that we could not have developed them, but that in terms of how we have developed socio-politically, it's not dependent upon purely genetic expression, but our engagement with one another and environmental factors, which is what the nature versus nurture debate is about. Like your attempts to boil it down to something like genetics, yet claiming that, environment in terms of education makes a massive difference, like homeschooling, is evidence against your position, but because you're trying to conflate nature and nurture, which is only really meant to, in this case, separate internal and external causes as one fundamentally genetic mildrew, you're missing the whole point of what the debate's actually about. The debate's about explanatory power. Is one characteristic of human behavior... oh god, I think the audio is totally messed up. So I'm gonna have to... yeah, I think it's like on my side. Like on the stream. So...
That's okay. Do you want to finish your statement?
Yeah, essentially, like just pointing it out to purely nature versus nurture, saying that it's a false dichotomy and everything's genetic, misses the point of why we've split into different epistemic fields in the first place. It's to give us better explanatory power, even if we accept the physicalist model, for the same reason that we don't characterize biology as physics, for the same reason we don't characterize biology as as chemistry, because it doesn't give the same amount of explanatory power. We are better separating, even under a physicalist framework, into different fields: psychology, anthropology, history, cultural studies. These have a profound importance.
The separation of field will be the ultimate deceiver and the ultimate confounder. Let's acknowledge that human psychology is a product of nature. I'm ready.
Either of the interlocutors or both, feel free to send them in chat to Mr. P or tag me at Amy Newman. Super chats do get priority in being read first. And with that, I'll Flamo for $2. I agree with Papa JF. Nurture is part of nature. I guess
All
that'd
right.
be for you perspective, because he's agreeing.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I was just trying to fix my
Oh no, you're good.
my audio. Yeah, I'm hoping that it's a bit better now, but I can't be sure.
I know that feel.
So yeah, sorry. Go on then.
So we'll come back to that. Nugget Man for $2 says, Hannah, how did I insult anyone? Well, then she can answer. Arcadia Outpost for $10. I don't know why 10-0. Social science, academia is activism. Whose purpose is it to smokescreen the failures of multiracial societies and act as the justification for shaming people who point those failures out?
I think that's absolutely if I may comment on that, I think that's absolutely appalling. I mean, a lot of the multiracial societies that you're pointing towards are largely successful. I mean, look at, for example, the United Kingdom. In terms of the British Empire, I mean, the empire itself was multiracial, and not only that, in terms of the success rate of Britain, it hasn't been modulated by any increase or decrease in immigration. In many cases, we've economically promoted immigration for the economic prosperity of our society. That's why the Windrush generation and the Caribbean immigrants came over here in the first place. The idea of it being multiculturalism leading to worse economic outcomes or worse social outcomes is ludicrous. Cultures offer a variety of different benefits to the economic prosperity and ideological prosperity as well. And that's why we have internal and external critique in terms of norms and conventions.
For $5 from Oflamo, race is a label created by the state to control populations. Before 970, Spain is in Europe, so people from Spain are European.
The state at some point used the words related to races, but the concept of race pre-existed any use of the state of it. It's just the familiar recognition that the people we see around us are physically distinct enough that we can place them in categories and we can develop expectations from these placements.
I mean, we do seem to think that there's only about 3% genetic difference between all of humanity, right? There's not a massive genetic difference, and in terms of most of that difference is aesthetic, linked to so for example, whether white people were supposed to be bred with Neanderthals, Indo-Asian people bred with another form of Homo erectus, and black people who are based in Africa didn't breed with anyone but other Homo sapiens, from what we're aware. And we may even think that there is another humanoid that we may have bred with, I think in India, but I'm not sure. In terms of outcomes of IQ, in terms of outcomes in prosperity, if you take, for example, people in India, they'll have a lower economic outcome than people in the UK. But if you take someone from India and you put them in the UK, they'll have a higher economic outcome than someone from the UK.
Well, the reason for this is that they're getting selected through immigration. So you're not picking people at random. If you were to pick people at random without making them go through form tests, they wouldn't fare better than the average UK. As far as fucking with the Neanderthal, yes, my ancestors had sex with the Neanderthal, and I'm proud of it. I would do it again.
And moving along, Bubblegum Gun for $2. Which came first, nature or nurture? Rib Gwen. So nature, nurture first.
Well, as I say, it's a false dichotomy. So nature was always there, and period. That's it.
The nature-nurture debate is really just a way of trying to give greater explanatory power to certain characteristics which impact the social development of an individual. It's not which came first. They're both essentially supposed to happen to the individual at the same time. But in terms of epistemologically, the nature versus nurture debate isn't the result, and even biology is the result of prior epistemic causes, like which is cultural and which is cultural in origin, like the acceptance and denial of certain epistemological norms. I'm not a physical reductionist, so I don't even think that this can really be boiled down to brain states. The reasons and the choices that our ancestors have made and the choices that we made are distinct from the genetics that produce our brains. I even think that this understanding of brains being the only way to explain our behavior is, to be entirely honest, they're flawed massively, which is why neuroscience hasn't really managed to make so much headway.
And getting your questions in right now. Feel free, guys, to continue tagging me at Amy Newman or Mr. P. We'll both get your questions, and super chats are being read first. $5 from Parahesia. If JF is correct, life outcome correlations between an adopted sibling and unadopted will not equal correlation between both unadopted. Is this true?
That's an interesting experiment. I've never seen it, because usually when there's an event that justifies an adoption, it justifies the adoption of the two siblings. It's very rare that you'll have separation of siblings that way. But I'd be interested in hearing about the study that did that. I never heard about one.
Moving right along, another $5 from Parahesia. PP, I think there is a misunderstanding. Can you explain the concept of heritability and how it is measured using twin studies?
When we talk about like I remember I actually read like a couple of the articles that JF sent, which was my first ever engagement in twin studies. I'd like to point out I'm a philosopher, not a scientist. And from what I gained from the articles, in terms of heritability, were actually once I pull up one of the articles that was against this. So wait a minute, I just closed it to try and boost me bloody buffering. Wait a minute. So there's an article called Beyond Heritability, which essentially argues that although human behavioral traits, the heritability of human behavioral traits are inheritable, there are other factors in behavioral science which are outlined because of twin studies. We can see that there are causal effects which are environmental in origin, primarily for the fact that certain behaviors are inherited, while certain behaviors are modulated by environmental transactions.
And all right, we're going to be moving on to some regular viewer questions. So if you have a thought bubble, now is your chance to get the opinion of either of our two interlocutors. Weibo Johnson says, please ask JF if he likes eugenics or if his beliefs lead to eugenics.
No, I like natural selection, and in fact, I oppose to eugenics because I think that people are too stupid to make the decision of what's a good gene. I believe that the best arbiter of what's a good gene is nature, the confrontation between ourselves with nature and with the challenges that it brings.
It's funny that you say that because obviously, like, if you were to propose that nature, if you were to propose that everything's genetic and that the nature-nurture dichotomy is not necessarily correct, you could recognize that an individual's knowledge of genetics may lead them to a greater overall it's nature understanding itself, right? Because everything's nature, so nature's understanding itself, and it's understanding how to do things in a different and better way overall in terms of outcome, which is essentially what many of the left-wing academics who you think are arguing for purely nature or arguing for a purely nature versus nurture discussion, many of them actually accept what you're promoting, mainly like Lenin and Trotsky, were arguing for the genetic modification of individuals to try and create a better society.
Yeah, the problem
So
is people are
it's
too mundane in their preference. You give them knowledge and they will start caring about blonde hairs, blue eyes, and intelligence, and they will drive us away from what nature really needs.
but this is the thing. Like when we talk about notions of success, this is why we had that debate prior. Because when we talk about something like success or moral terms, you say you're a moral nihilist, but then when you use terms like good and so on, they always have moral implications. Like, whether an individual, so if an individual was to suffer more, let's say greater insensitivity to pain might have a greater overall increased level of gene transmissibility or survival rates or whatever, that doesn't necessarily mean that we ought to want to feel more pain. That's the issue. It's like the naturalistic fallacy. So
Well,
if we
Because this in the last debate, moral nihilism does not entail me to not have moral preferences. I can like
yes, it
certain
does.
things about the
That-
world.
that's
I can want the
absolutely
world to
what it
be
does.
one way while being a moral nihilist.
No, that's exactly what it is. Like a moral nihilist would say that there is nothing more. You can't say a moral preference, because
So
they
a
don't
moral
exist.
nihilist can't eat
Because-
ice cream. We've been through this.
No,
A moral nihilist,
a moral
can,
nihilist
like
can
hot
have
dogs.
preferences. They can't have moral like
Like,
the word
wait.
moral doesn't exist anymore. That's the whole nihilist part, man. like
They can have
nihilist.
preferences about anything, including what you would call moral.
And so that's going to be the last word because it was JF's question. And so we are moving on. Another $5 super chat. PP, I don't think that answered my question. And this is coming from Parahesia again. What is the definition of heritability and how is it measured?
I don't think I could give you the definition, to be entirely honest with you. I'm just not, to be entirely honest with you, as what's the right word? Well read on the topic. I'm not a geneticist. I'm not a biologist. I'd probably direct that question to JF. I imagine he's probably more qualified.
To help PP here, irritability is simply defined as the frequency of repetition between the last generation phenotypic feature and the next generation phenotypic features. And so you would say that something is irritable if 100, let's say it's 100% irritable if 100% of the parents who had blue eyes led to 100% of children who had blue eyes. And as you go down the continuum, you have less and less irritability. Now, irritability, as is understood in twin studies, is often associated with specific sub-definitions of irritability. And when we do the difference between monozygotic twin and dizygotic twin, ultimately it boils down to a form of irritability which you can attribute specifically to the genetic difference. So in that case, they have words for it, but I would call it simply genetic irritability as opposed to environmental irritability. And you have other forms of things that can lead to an irritability appearance, but that are not really genetic irritability. You can have cultural transmission, which ultimately is handled by genes, but you can also have random and probabilistic effects of genes that can be counted in a form of irritability. There are 3 or 4 categories of subdefinitions when you enter twin studies.
I know that in terms of the epigenetic studies that I was mentioning before, the heritability of obesity was modulated by, to a greater degree, by environment than it was by genetic causes. So my understanding of heritability was essentially like obviously the rate at which something was passed down. I obviously still probably couldn't give you like a bang-on dictionary, like a bang-on definition of it. But yeah, like in terms of I think what we've been discussing here, JF would like to say that the heritability of, so for example, success and outcome is dependent upon genetic factors and genetic factors alone, and even the environmental factors can be attributed to prior genetic factors. Whilst I would say that the debate itself is being situated in such a way as to point the difference between internal and external factors in terms of how our behaviors are structured and develop. So whether we inherit a certain behavior or not is not dependent upon simply internal genetic material, genetic makeup, but rather cultural, political, and environmental factors as well.
And it was his question, so that's the last word. Question from Peach Pie Lord. Where is the apple falling on head gene? Maybe the head gene? Where is the apple falling on the head gene?
Quite simple. There are trees that their apples fall. There are trees that their apples don't fall. And those trees that survive are those that let the apple fall just at the right moment, when it's ripe and when it's ready to get transported by a human so that it can seed an apple tree elsewhere. The apple falls on Isaac Newton's head ultimately because it wanted Isaac Newton to spread its sperm elsewhere. That's what's happening. Isaac Newton was the uterus of this apple, and in thinking about gravity, he has acted against the interest of the tree. What the tree really wanted is to be carried by Isaac Newton to some distant place where its children could be born.
Question or more comment from Commander Cardi. Your concerns seem to be more related to how the leftists are going to misuse the dichotomy for their ideology than the epistemological choice made to increase exponentiary power.
Absolutely. I'm extremely worried about the use of this fallacy, because if I was to complain against every fallacy in psychology, I would spend my day here and we wouldn't be done. This fallacy is particularly vicious because it leads to the conclusion, as Elizabeth Bartolet concluded, I need to take children away from poor white parents and give them to rich black parents because it's going to be so much better. She doesn't get it. She doesn't get it, or she gets it and she wants to push for a subversive push on Western civilization. But in any case, yes, it's dramatic. As far as the epistemologic aspect, I do care about it. I'm a scientist, so I care about how these false dichotomies lead us to false theories. But it's so much less graver than the interventions of the states that are being pushed that it's almost a secondary matter.
From Pancake of Destiny, why Republic of South Africa was growing.
I think it's for PP, this one.
Right, sorry, I had to restart my audio there.
Do you want me to reread it? It's why Republic of South Africa.
I heard you. It's just more of the fact my stream wouldn't have heard it, if that's okay.
Oh yeah, I'll say it again for you. Why Republic of South Africa was growing fast when governed by white people, and it started to fall apart after natives took it over. This proves genes matter.
Well, no, it doesn't. I mean, like, if you look at, like, for example, the effects of the cultural effects of apartheid on education and the capacity to run something like a farm, for example, that holds massive importance. That's genetically, that's not determined by genetics. I mean, you've got plenty of black farmers around the world. You've got plenty of farmers that are of different races around the world that didn't suffer apartheid and so know how to run a farm. The cultural significance of South Africa is what makes this analogy important. Like we do see black farmers, we do see Asian farmers, we do see people of different races, managing to essentially run businesses and structure economies, but we do not see usually people who've come from great racial disparity and poverty being usually competent enough to end the economic disparity that they face. In the words of Kant, the freedom is the prerequisite for the maturity for freedom. White people were given freedoms that black people were not given, and so have developed the means necessary to use that freedom to a greater advantage in that scenario.
And if you want an example of where white dominance isn't present like it is in South Africa, just watch Ethiopia. You'll see how these societies converge when there's no white supremacist controlling their politics.
Well,
because Ethiopia was never invaded.
Ethiopia, in terms of, trying to say that, in terms of the global economic agenda, that Ethiopia hasn't faced massive, catastrophic economic issues. It would just totally undermine that as an example as well. Maybe if you were to use something like like, you know, for example, like like, you know, like the like if you had like something like, I don't know, rates of like farmers in the United States, in Britain, in European countries where they've had equal education systems, where they've had they haven't had systemic racism for the same degree. They've had lower rates of poverty, criminality, and you know, haven't been, you know, economically disadvantaged for hundreds of years. That may, you know, be a better comparison. And again, you know, there are other races and there are other places that have not only black people but obviously Asian people that farm just as well.
From Donald Anderson, question to JF. You said your moral nihilists can have moral preferences. You said moral nihilists can have moral preferences. If so, what's the difference between moral nihilism and moral non-cognitivism?
I don't know specifically how it is defined, non-cognitivism. I think it's a more general term that encompasses broader stuff, but I'm not sure. I would have to check it. But what a moral nihilist is simply someone who denies that moral statements are subject to true verification. So the statement, for example, it is bad to murder, is not a statement that is true or false. It is only true or false in the head of someone. And so it is in relation to what people want and desire from the world. I can say that I don't like murder, and therefore to me, that murder is wrong is true, but it's not a verifiably true statement.
Just to point out, that would be subjectivism or like that's kind of what they're arguing. So like just to think, obviously you came in with the biology definitions and stuff. This is sort of like a philosophically specific question. In terms of nihilism is a rejection of, so for example, an individual, their preferences, like if we were to accept, let's say, the Nietzschean position, he's not a nihilist, but he's arguing against the threat of nihilism. The individual's preferences can be essentially culturally imbued by a certain, let's say, religion or environmental factors which have given them their preferences. So even when they think they're acting in their own interests, they're acting in the interests of someone else. And so they aren't right or wrong even against their own internal states. The point is that there is no such thing as right or wrong, that it's all a power play, that there is no right or wrong at all. That's nihilism. In terms of subjectivism, this would be the truth aptness of a statement is based on the attitudes of an individual. Or in a non-cognitivism, that an individual's they are not truth apt and simply expressions of an individual's preferences. Now that would be they would be the separations that I think you need to deal with, which is I think something that you do need to tackle with. But you know, that's just
I remain my statement. I am a moral nihilist because I deny the truth aptness of moral statements.
And that's the final word. Mr. P, why are genetic studies avoided by most scientists these days? Or from Mr. P, from Pat Riley, why are genetic studies avoided by most scientists these days?
Who's that to?
Well, it's because there's a general oppression of people who come with genetic and irritability-based explanations of human behavior, because there's the same thing that pushed CRT onto our schools and onto our elementary schools at this point is the social pressure from leftists who are taking over our institutions, and they don't want to hear that the world is unequal because they fear that they won't be able to fix it. And what leftists like to do is to technocratize, to socially engineer the world, and they are very alarmed at the possibility that they may not be able to, if it's genetic differences that cause the differences in behavior.
In the words of Peter Singer, equality is not natural, it's artificial. Like when we talk about equality, we're not talking about equity, and we're not talking about differences in outcome. We're talking about how can we consider individuals' interests equally. That's not something that is natural in origin. Nobody necessarily argues it is. Also, leftists aren't against genetic studies. I mean, many leftists, like I was talking about, like far left, in terms of like Trotsky and Lenin, they were big into genetics in terms of, and if you look at, for example, I don't know if you would consider the Communist Party in China to be left, but they're doing a lot of genetic research, man. Like it's not like they're against genetics at all. Like the reality of the situation is that the ideology is not incompatible with genetics. In fact, most leftists claim to be materialists. They would like to put everything down to material contentions that exist between class-based structures rather than, let's say, ideological contentions, which I would argue for. So in terms of like physicalism, it wouldn't be incompatible at all. Many leftists are actually pro genetic research. The difference is that we don't necessarily, many leftists or many academics don't necessarily put absolute credence upon JF's position upon genetics, which is that it gives greater explanatory power than, let's say, philosophy, psychology, anthropology, history, and etc. combined, and that there are other genetic studies that may need to be done which show other transactions with genetics and the environment, like epigenetics and so on. So when we look at how academics is unfolding, it's not based on a simple left-right dichotomy. Academics unfolds based upon individuals' pursuit for truth, and okay, that can be influenced by the rationality in which they endeavor to, in which they accept. But there are the many, not only liberals, but also middle of the road people who describe themselves as middle of the road. At one point, I think the United States had 46% of academics say that they were neither right nor left. So when we look at the disparity between like why people are not, engaged in, let's say, more genetic studies or twin studies, and why they go towards something maybe like epigenetic studies, or why they would go towards something like philosophy or psychology and so on, it probably is more to do with their belief in the explanatory power rather than some sort of political conspiracy.
And question from Matt Plott. Are all bad things due to nurture? How convenient, PP.
Sorry, what? Are all things due to nurture?
Yes, so the last part was a comment, but the question is, are all bad things due to nurture?
No, I mean, like for example, if a volcano erupts, it's like we would consider that a natural evil, quote unquote. Like the reality of the situation is like you could be born disabled. That could be a bad thing. How we approach something which is negative is what we actually engage in with ethics. It's how we ought to behave in terms of our behaviors. So, for example, there's a famous quote by Jean-Paul Sartre which says, "The disabled man disables himself." He doesn't necessarily mean that, they are inflicting their own disability upon themselves, but rather that how they approach their disability is what characterizes them as accepting the identity of someone being disabled. There are famous speeches of people saying that they were told that they were inferior, like mentally disabled, and have succeeded regardless. There are numerous success stories of people who've become world-class athletes or physically capable, regardless after having lost limbs and so on. How we approach, what nature deals us, or nurture deals us, the environment, is primarily to do with our ethics. And I wouldn't necessarily say it's that human behavior is determinate from either external or internal causes, because I believe in free will. So, that's kind of how I'd answer that question.
Question from Pat Riley. How do you explain the elevated levels of genius IQ and the high level of Nobel Prizes within the Jewish population worldwide as compared to population levels?
Well, as far as the Nobel Prize, I don't consider it as a measure of achievement in science. I consider it as a measure of social networking. So my conclusion would be that Jews are very good at social networking. As far as higher IQ,